Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello all. Just as a reminder, this is part 1 of a multi-part series. Today, we have Sonia interviewing John.
Hello, this is Sonia. I'm here with Truth in My Days director John Torse for a discussion about another important topic. John, I've noticed that one of the charges skeptics bring up against the gospel books is that the gospel according to John is so different from the other three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which scholars refer to as the Synoptic Gospels, with the same I, that is, because they're so similar to one another.
Yes.
The skeptics say that it is the gospel according to John that portrays Jesus as the divine Son of God and has the great emphasis on salvation by faith in him. And they say that these ideas developed later, that they weren't part of the original teachings of Jesus, and they support that by pointing out that the Gospel of John was written very late, sometime in the 80-90s, which is a good 60 or so years after Jesus' death. They say that in this time, these legendary ideas developed and were added to this book, and that's why it's so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Oh, yes. All sorts of skeptics have been saying such things for a long time.
Does this claim have any merit? Is it a challenge to the message of Christianity?
No. They are wrong on every point they say, except, of course, that the gospel, according to John, is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And yes, it was the last one written.
So what's the mistake, then, that they make?
Well, there are 3 very good reasons why they are wrong. The first is this. Even if the Gospel of John were written as late as they claim, the idea that this means that there are legendary accretions in it wouldn't work. The second reason is that John was in fact not written as late as they claim. And the third is there is actually a very obvious reason to account for the difference between John and the Synoptic Gospels.
Why wouldn't the possibility of the legendary accretions be viable if it really was written so late?
All right, we'll start with that one, the first one. Let's assume for the sake of argument that they are right about the date that John was published somewhere in the decade of the 90s. AD 90s. They're not correct, as we'll see, but we'll assume it for the sake of argument. The question then is, if John was written 60 years after the events it describes, the events of Jesus' life, ministry, miracles, death, and resurrection, 60 years, is that enough time for legends to develop?
Well, I think people could actually remember back 60 years, so I suppose if the legends did develop, people would say, oh, no, that's not true.
That would seem to be an obvious point. Not everybody can remember back 60 years. I cannot, but then I'm not even 60 years old. I can easily remember back to important events 50 years ago or more. It's 50 years ago that we moved from Montreal, where I was born, to Toronto. And I have very vivid and detailed memories of the events surrounding that and our first vacation when we came here and so on. And I could describe those quite accurately and in a lot of detail. I couldn't tell you what I ate for breakfast a week ago, probably, because that's not important. But when it's important things, when it's things that really matter to you, things that are noteworthy, then of course you can remember back that far. I can't go quite 60 years, but my mom can certainly go back 60 years, 70 years, even 80 years. Now, the idea that eyewitnesses are not reliable if they're speaking long after the events, we'd have to ask, why do so many schools bring in veterans to talk to the students, and as well Holocaust survivors to warn students about the horrors of this kind of evil that was done at the time? World War II ended 77 years ago, yet these people remember quite vividly these events. So you can't on the one hand say that, sure, let's bring veterans into the school to talk about their memories, and at the same time say, no, people can't really remember back that far.
Well, I suppose for matters like the Holocaust, it's not controversial today, not like a matter of religion.
It's not controversial. We have plenty of evidence for it. Only absolute fools would deny that it happened. The point, nevertheless, is that each Holocaust survivor can give his own memories of what he personally saw and encountered during those times, and we accept those. Same thing with every veteran. We could read books on World War II and see pictures and read about the battles and find out the large details, but the small things, the everyday events, we have to talk to individuals or read the writings of the individuals to tell us that. Now, I refer to my move to Toronto in 1972, and I was an eyewitness to that. I could give my accounts. So could my sister, so could my brother, so could my mom. But these were just personal events. You're not going to find a lot of other people out there who could really talk about that. But Jesus' ministry was not like that. It was a public event that was seen by thousands upon thousands of people. So certainly these are things that could have been remembered even 60 years after the fact.
In those days, did people typically even live to 60 years, though?
That's a good point to bring up, because people say that, well, in ancient times, people didn't live nearly as long as they do now. Lifespan, life expectancy was much shorter. And therefore, even if today you can have people with memories going back 70 or 80 years, it wasn't the case then. The problem with that challenge is people misunderstand what an average lifespan is. It's an average. It factors together how long everybody lived and then averages it together. And they overlook the fact that in the ancient world, there were so many early deaths caused by childbirth among young women, death in childbirth, and many children didn't survive. They were quite vulnerable in that day and age. However, if they made it through infant mortality, if they survived that, if they didn't die as in infancy or as young children, or they didn't serve in the military, which also tended to depress the average age, then it was a different story. According to the scholar Karen Cocaine in her book Experiencing Old Age in Ancient Rome, published by Routledge in 2011, she points out that infant mortality and military service depressed the average life expectancy. But if these didn't get you, she writes, quote, from around the 1st century BC onwards, the age of 60 or 65 was commonly mentioned as the threshold of old age. In other words, you weren't considered old until you hit 60 or 65. And then after that, you enjoyed your old years. She goes on to demonstrate that if people in those days survived childhood, childbirth, military service, Romans could expect to live as long as we do today. In another book, Memory, Jesus, and the Synoptic Gospels by Robert K. McIver, published by SPL, also in 2011, McIver says that of the 60,000 or so potential eyewitnesses to the things we're talking about, the life, miracles, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, of the 60,000 or so potential eyewitnesses, between 18 and 20,000 would still be alive after 30 years, and between 600 and 1,100 after 60 years.
And where does he get these numbers?
From checking all of the written documentation on when people died, what people said in those days about ages. There's plenty of written and inscriptional evidences available to us from those days. And this is what he goes through to figure out what was the average lifespan, how many people made it past a certain age, and what would be the ages of people during Jesus' ministry. And then you just crunch some numbers, and that's what he comes up with.
So could those legends be developed and added in such a short time?
Well, if it's 60 years, and it isn't, but if it were 60 and people, so many eyewitnesses are still alive, the answer is no. The answer is absolutely not. The highly respected Roman historian A.N. Sherwin White in his book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, showed through, various ways, but through a detailed study of Herodotus' writings. Herodotus was that great Greek historian who was considered the father of historical writing, actually. And he showed through a detailed study of Herodotus' writings the rate at which legends develop, and showed that it takes many generations, certainly more than two, for the development to actually overwrite the actual history that's being recorded. So even if the Gospel according to John were published in the 90s, it wouldn't be enough time for the facts to be displaced by legend. And I think that liberal scholars recognized that, skeptics recognized that, and this is why initially they try to push the date of the Gospel books far beyond that time. They try to push it well into the 2nd century and even the later part of the 2nd century. One very influential scholar, F.C. Bauer of the Tübingen School in Germany, back in the 19th century, and this is a good illustration, actually, of how liberal scholarship works. And unfortunately, to a large extent, how scholarship in general works when you're outside of hard sciences like engineering. F.C. Bauer came up with this view based on the study of certain documents called the Clementines. And the Clementines were two writings purporting to be from a fellow called Clement, which some suggested might be the Clement who wrote that book, First Clement, in the 1st century, one of the so-called apostolic writings. Some suggested that it could be the Clement who's mentioned in the New Testament in passing, in one of Paul's salutations. Could be that those were the same person. But these writings showed up, a couple of documents going into a lot of detail about Clement's association with Paul and his supposed conversion. Now, there's no mention of these anywhere in the historical record until Eusebius mentions it in the year 325, so long after eyewitnesses or New Testament times. Bauer was actually a philosopher. He was a follower of Hegelian philosophy. Hegelian philosophy was a system devised by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel in the very late 18th century, mostly the early 19th century. And Hegel had a view of history that he described as the dialectic. He said all of history hinges on conflict. The situation as it is, he called the thesis, and whenever there's a thesis, it always gives rise to an opposing force, an antithesis or antithesis. And the thesis and the antithesis fight until they unite into a new thesis that he called the synthesis. They come together. That synthesis then becomes the status quo, the current thesis. It gives rise to yet another antithesis, and again you have conflict until they resolve into a synthesis, which then becomes the new thesis, and another antithesis rises, and so on. And this was his view of what drives history. It was very influential in things like Marxism and Darwinism, and it was influential on F.C. Bauer. So he, in his mind, concocted the idea that Christianity as we know it came out of a dialectic, a conflict between Jewish Christianity, which he called Petrine Christianity, it's from Peter, and Gentile Christianity, Pauline Christianity, it came from Paul, and these two forces were in constant struggle until they united into a synthesis, which is what he called the church. The church that eventually developed was the synthesis of this battle. He gave no evidence for this view at all. In fact, his arguments really have to be accounted a farce. You remember there's a part in Acts where Paul faces down, Peter, not Paul. The scene in Acts, chapter 8, where Peter faces down this magician, Simon Magus. Well, in the Clementines, there's an incident this incident is recorded, and Bauer speculated that this was hidden code, that Simon Magus actually represented Pauline Christianity, and so this was some kind of coded message showing the battle between Petrine and Pauline Christianity. So on the basis of this non-basis, there's no evidence, he cooked up this view and then said that, well, the gospel books came out of this conflict resolution, so they had to have been written very, very late. And what dates did he pick? Well, he said Matthew was the first. It was written around the year AD 130, and Luke around 150, and Mark a little later. John, he said, because it has this well-developed picture of Jesus, couldn't possibly have been earlier than the year 160 and probably 170 or later. And he published this in the year 1844, and this was accepted as what they called, quote, the assured results of critical scholarship. Do you see anything in there that could remotely be considered scholarship?
No, it seems like more like the results of his imagination.
It's not scholarship at all. It's not based on any actual evidence to support his view. It ignores the vast amount of evidence we have among the early Christian writers as to who wrote the gospel books and when and how Christianity developed. But for liberal scholarship, it doesn't matter. What matters is some view that allows you to discredit Christianity and its foundational documents. Another example in here of how bogus this is, as I said, Bauer put Matthew, the first gospel book, at the year AD 130. What evidence did he bring for that? Why 130?
Did he have some manuscripts?
No manuscripts, no evidence. The reason was simply this. If he assumed that Jesus died in the year 30, let's just add 100 years to that to make sure it's out of eyewitness times. So that 130 is pulled off the top of his head. And since Matthew is the first, you have to put later dates on the other books. And this, folks, believe it or not, this is what passes for critical scholarship, and this is what everybody accepted because, hey, a scholar said so. Now, we love scholarship. We're starting, I think some of us are becoming guilty of scholarolatry, and we don't realize how much of scholarship isn't actually scholarship at all. And that's why what we have to do is insist on evidence. If you find the video of my debate with Dr. Shabir Ali, it's on YouTube, and look at my opening statement, that's what I had to hammer down. Because opponents of Christianity will simply tell you, scholars say this, scholars say that. Scholars say Matthew was written in 130, as if that settles it. It doesn't. It's only the evidence that settles it, and evidence overrides liberal skeptics' claims. In the case of Bauer, for almost 100 years, scholars accepted these dates, with no question, the assured results of critical scholarship because Bauer said so. And that was it. And it didn't change until 1935. A year earlier than that, a graduate student named Colin Roberts, working at the John Rylands Library, it's attached to the University of Manchester, he came across a little scrap of papyrus, an ancient manuscript that had been dug up at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt by archaeologists. That's a huge mound of garbage, essentially. It was a garbage dump. And it was filled with things covering centuries and included a lot of written documentation. And because Oxyrhynchus is in the desert, it's very dry, these things survived. Papyrus, which is the writing material on which things were written in the first century, including the original copies of the gospel books, it's not a very secure thing. It's not something that lasts for a long time. It breaks down easily, which is why we don't have a lot. It's only in really dry places where it survived. And so this garbage dump at Oxyrhynchus survived. And they dug out of all these little scraps of New Testament writings. A lot of other things as well. It very much enhanced our knowledge of Koine Greek from the first century. But there was this little scrap that had not been identified, had been sent to the John Rylands Library. And Roberts, when he looked at it, he put together letters on it, he realized that this was actually from the Gospel according to John. It was not a big thing, maybe the size of a credit card or so, but it was clearly from the Gospel according to John. And the date of this was dated paleographically by the writing style, like all the ancient documents were. He could have dated it anywhere from about the year 80 up to about the year 125. He picked the latest possible date in that range. He said dates to around 125. And here's the significance of that. Remember that the assured results of critical scholarship told us that John could not possibly have been written before 160 at the earliest. Based on no evidence, now you had a piece of hard evidence that at latest dated John to a good 35 years before the earliest possible date, Bauer told us. Well, that kind of should have completely discredited liberal scholarship. It doesn't. But they were forced to admit that, no, John wasn't written in the last quarter of the 2nd century. It was a 1st century writing. Scholars now put it to around 110 to 125, and according to Philip Comfort, a text critical expert, by around by around the year 1990, the majority of scholars were tending towards a date of 100 for this little piece of papyrus called P52. Now, of course, liberal scholars are trying to push it late again, move it later and later, but it doesn't matter. The point is, the hard evidence completely destroyed the claims of liberal scholarship. And this is one of the problems with scholarship, is too few scholars, even evangelicals, look at the actual evidence. They just accept what scholars say. You remember when we talked about the problem with that quote in Mark chapter 1, verse 2, where most of the manuscripts, the overwhelming majority, the 99% plus, will tell you, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face. It has two quotes there, one from Malachi 3:1, followed by one from Isaiah 40, verse 3. And that's why it says, as it is written in the prophets. Well, a very few corrupt manuscripts read as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, and yet scholars will tell us that these are the most accurate manuscripts. The vast majority are wrong, and that's what gets into modern translations like the NIV, the ESV, the NASB, and it's a mistake. So if you're an evangelical and you want to say there are no mistakes in the Bible, but you're holding to this reading, which is a mistake, what do you do? Well, most of them will claim that, well, this was a convention, a Jewish writing convention of the time where they would string together quotes from a variety of prophets and just pen to them the name of the most prominent prophet, as if that would solve the problem. It wouldn't really. It would still be a mistake. If there were such a writing convention among uninspired people, that's fine. It would still be a mistake in the Bible. But here's the thing. You will find scholar after scholar making this claim. The question is, where's the evidence for this claim? Now, the funny thing is, when you start looking into it and you start reading one scholar who says this and look at his footnote, he simply directs you to another scholar who says it, and that one directs you to another scholar who says it. You really don't find evidence. You have to go through many, many rabbit trails before you come to one point where they try to find evidence, and that's one fellow who refers to a book by a Jewish scholar, Chages. And the problem is, you look through that entire book and you find no such Jewish writing practice. And so here's the problem with much of scholarship. People assume that the scholar has looked into each issue on his own and looked at the evidence, followed it, and the reality is no. Most of them they went to seminary, they heard things on this, and they just accepted it with little or no actual evidence. The only thing they know really well is what they did their own dissertation on.
John, where did you find all these facts that so many evangelicals don't know?
You have to dig. If you want to do critical thinking, there's 3 questions you always have to ask when you hear something. How do you know? What's your evidence? And what are you leaving out? Very few people ever ask those questions. They just hear what the scholar says, they assume it's correct. But you have to ask, what is the evidence for it? That's crucial. And then once you're given the evidence, you have to check it out. This is what I did in the case of, say, Mark 1:2. You need to look and say, look, does this evidence bear out the claims that come from it? And as I saw here, I tracked through all the footnotes. I was looking for the actual evidence. Anybody can do that. Most of them don't, but they should. And that's why I found there is no evidence for such a Jewish writing convention. The quote, as you see it in the NIV, the ESV, the NASB, and so on, is wrong. It's an error. But fortunately, that's not what the original Bible said. It said, as it is written in the prophets, which is not an error. Another example, just one, I could give you so many. When I was in seminary and we were doing textual criticism, and the professor said, the last 12 verses of Mark are not authentic. Evidence, well, there are 17 non-Markan words in those last 12 verses. And by that he means 17 words that don't appear anywhere else in the Gospel according to Mark. That proves it was written by somebody else. Well, none of my fellow students questioned that for a moment. I asked them later, outside class, I asked them, so you think the last 12 verses of Mark are not authentic? They said, oh, of course not. I said, why? Well, there's 17 non-Markan words in those last 12 verses. I said, okay, what about the previous 12 verses? The last 4 verses of Mark 15 and the first 8 verses of Mark 16. What about those? Are those authentic? Well, of course. How many non-Markan words are there in those 12 verses? I couldn't tell you. They wouldn't dream of checking to see whether this is a good argument or not. Well, I did. I looked through it. I counted 22 non-Markan words in those 12 verses. This is not evidence. But this is what happens. You go to seminary, you hear it, and you just accept it. We'll get back to that, but let's continue on this. They were forced to bring John into the first century. They still try to squeeze it as late as possible. That's why they put it into the 90s, because they still had a cutoff point. They now decided that Mark was the first gospel book published. It wasn't. It's against all the evidence, but they needed to have it there. And Mark includes Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple, which happened in the year 70, when the Romans came and after having finally defeated the rebellion that started in the year 66, they finally penetrated into the city of Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple. Well, Jesus talks about that in Mark chapter 13. And so here's the problem for the liberal scholars. They don't believe Jesus could give genuine predictive prophecy. He could not foretell the future. So the only way that could be there in Mark is if Mark was written after the fact. And so 70 became the cutoff, the earliest possible date for Mark, according to liberal scholars. They've moved it back a few years. Maybe it could go back as far as 66, because once the Jewish uprising begins against the Romans, then a clever person could figure out how it's going to end. But that's the cutoff. So all the gospel books, if they're first century, have to be squeezed in somewhere between 70 and 100. And John is the last. It's in the 90s. And these late dates are de rigueur for liberal scholars, and to a large extent are accepted by many evangelical scholars. Now, another interesting point is that legends do develop about historical characters. Consider Muhammad, for example, the founder of Islam. According to the Quran, Muhammad did no miracles. He was challenged a number of times to do miracles, and every time he says, "Look, I'm just flesh and blood. The only miracle I bring you is the book." Now, in later Islamic writings, miracles are ascribed to him, most notably one where he took out his sword and cut the moon in half. So, yes, legends do develop about characters. Saint Nicholas was a bishop, I think, in the 4th century, who's become Santa Claus now. And you know how many legends have developed around there? Flying through the air, 8 tiny reindeer in a sleigh, bringing presents to all good little boys and girls. Legends grow about historical characters. And there were attempts to make legends about Jesus, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, which came very much later, latter part of the 2nd century and onwards. But the interesting thing is the Christians always rejected these. They always said they were fake. They did not accept these legendary developments. The things that liberals say are legendary developments, the miracles, the resurrection, and so on, they are there in the very beginning. They are there in the eyewitness documents. They didn't develop later.
So we know Christians rejected the contents of the Gnostic Gospels from Christian writings, or how do we know?
Yes, the Christian writings. You have a steady stream of Christian writers going back to Clement of Rome. His letter is generally dated around 95. I think a better case could be made for the year 70 on that. And it goes through writers like Papias and Ignatius and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and so on. And they write an awful lot, and they talk about the books. They talk about the 4 gospel books, their origins, who wrote them, when, how. And as you move through the years and you get to the latter part of the 2nd century, they start mentioning, oh, this book has shown up and it's bogus. And this book has shown up and it's bogus. Stay away from it. So we can pretty well figure out when those books came into existence. On some of them, there's also internal evidence that will tell us when they came into existence. So we know they were late, and we know that from the beginning, as soon as they showed up, the church rejected them. Some of the legends that developed were just absolutely ludicrous. There's one in which a Jewish priest hides in a cemetery to watch Jesus' tomb, and then he sees Jesus come out, and he's so tall his head goes into the clouds, and he's followed by a cross, an ambulatory cross, also very tall, that's talking. So you had some rather absurd attempts to develop legends about Jesus, but they just did not catch on. They already had the truth. They didn't need this kind of nonsense. And there's one other problem for the liberal scholars who want to push the dates these far. And they want to push John into the 90s because they say that John, the stuff he has in there, the deity of Jesus, the need to believe in him, to be saved, salvation by faith alone, well, these are legendary developments that took such a long time to come about. They're too clever by half here. It reminds me of that saying, oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. And no, that's not Shakespeare. It's actually Sir Walter Scott from Marmion, A Tale of Flodden Field from 1808. By pushing the gospel books late, they claim that Paul's writings, Paul's letters, are the earliest Christian writings. And they will put those into the 50s. And unfortunately, a lot of evangelical scholars will say that as well. But here's the thing. There's nothing in John that's not in Paul.
Well, why didn't they just push Paul later too, then?
Well, they can't. They believe Paul is historical and the events surrounding his life tied into dates of actual history. So there's no real way to push Paul later. What they do is they take Paul's letters and they try to identify them as forgeries, later forgeries not really written by Paul. There would be a heavy burden of proof on them if they want to argue that, and they fail utterly to meet that burden. But even so, they leave some of them. They say, well, these are authentic. Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and everything that they say is legendary in John, a later development, is already there in Paul's writings from the 50s and the early 60s. So you cannot say John has to be in the 90s because that's how long it took for these ideas to develop, and those ideas are already there in documents from the 50s and early 60s that you admit come from those dates. So there's really no way to get away with discrediting the Gospel according to John by claiming that was written in the 90s.
Well, if all the material from John that they don't like is in Paul and Paul is first, then it seems like they've gotten themselves into a trap. What are they going to do now?
Well, yes, they have checkmated themselves with this approach. It kind of knocks into complete cocked hat the idea that these teachings that you see in John that they don't like about the deity of Jesus, about salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, there's no way to push those late. And yet, incredibly, there are prominent evangelical scholars who are willing to, in essence, write off the history of the gospel according to John, strange as that may seem. Let's listen here to Dr. Craig Evans, a highly respected evangelical scholar. You might know him from The Case for Christ. He's mentioned just in passing there, but he's one of the go-to guys in the follow-up book, The Case for the Real Jesus. What we're going to hear at this point is a conversation he's having with Dr. Bart Ehrman. And you might know Dr. Bart Ehrman. Here's a scholar who used to profess evangelical faith and then fell away from it first through the issue of textual criticism. And he's become a very high-profile opponent of Christianity now, writing books, doing debates, videos, and so on. He's probably best known for his book Misquoting Jesus, which introduced textual criticism to the masses. He's a primary opponent of Christianity now. Some Christians consider him the most dangerous opponent of Christianity. I don't agree with that assessment. I think some of them who call themselves evangelicals are actually more dangerous because they're undermining the faith from within.
And people trust them. They're not on their guard.
Yes. And the thing with Ehrman as well, without getting into a lot of detail, his arguments are not very clever. They're not very profound. He seems to be coasting on his reputation as a PhD scholar. I think what he says can be refuted rather easily. But anyway, getting back to the point here, in this clip, he is discussing the historicity of the gospel according to John. The first voice we will hear is that of Ehrman, and then we will hear Dr. Evans, and then they will go back and forth. So let's see what we're to think of this.
Okay, so in the Gospel of John, Jesus says a lot of I am sayings, very famous sayings. Before Abraham was, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world, etc. These I am sayings. And at one point, of course, he says, the Father and I are one. So my question to you is, do you think the historical Jesus really said these things?
I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus. I think most of these things were not uttered as we find them by the historical Jesus. So I suspect we don't have too much difference on John. My view is the Gospel of John is a horse of another color altogether. It's a different genre. John is often compared to the wisdom literature. It's like wisdom is personified. Chokmah, Lady Wisdom, or in Greek, Sophia. She wanders the streets. She calls out to people. She does things. Well, nobody would read that and think, did you see wisdom going down the street the other day? Nobody would think that as a literal person.
I suspect, my view, he doesn't give any evidence. Also, if you read John, it doesn't read like poetry. Of course, in poetry, you have personification of abstract qualities, sure, like wisdom, but do you ever personify someone who's already a person and turn him into, go the other way, make him an abstract quality?
That's actually a very interesting question. If this is to read like the wisdom literature and the personification of Chokmah, Sophia, wisdom, then what you have in those cases is, as you say, some kind of abstract quality being represented as a person. This would lead to all kinds of problems in that case. So what then is Jesus? Is he an abstract quality? Is he this logos that's the word you see at the beginning? The logos was with God. The logos was God. Was this supposed to be some kind of impersonal abstract quality like wisdom, and then Jesus is just a personification of it? Does that mean he didn't exist as a person at all? This kind of approach makes no sense at all. This would make it completely out of the realm of history, which I don't think Dr. Evans wants to do. But the problems, he says that this is a different genre. No, it's not. The style, the writing, it's very clearly historical narrative. There are a lot of references to historical people, time periods, lengths of time, descriptions of the surrounding. This is most certainly meant to be historical narrative. When he says that this is often compared to the wisdom literature, I have no idea who he's talking about. I've never heard a scholar comparing the gospel according to John to witness literature. If there are such, it must be the very extreme liberal, skeptical wing of liberal scholarship, something we should not be taking seriously at all. This just makes no sense to me. The idea that nobody would read Proverbs and think that wisdom there is meant to be a person, well, of course, but anybody who reads Proverbs or Psalms or the so-called wisdom literature and the poetic literature, nobody would think it's meant to be historical because it's presented in such a different fashion. The gospel, according to John, doesn't read like Proverbs. It doesn't read like Psalms. It reads like Matthew or Acts. It's history. Anything else problematic so far in what we heard here?
Besides the lack of evidence, and it's all just I think.
Well, that's true. He gives no actual reason for this, and unfortunately you're going to find a lot of that with the pronouncements of scholars. It's very much, trust me, I have a PhD. And we've made this point before in this discussion, you need to push for evidence. But what also grabbed my attention here is this flat-out denial that Jesus didn't say these things. Here is the gospel according to John, written under divine inspiration. It's God-breathed. It's written by Jesus' closest friend on earth. And yet, 20 centuries later, a scholar can sit there and just glibly say, nope, Jesus didn't actually say that.
What kind of motive would he even have, being an evangelical, for denying that Jesus said those things?
Well, I can't speak to Evans' motives personally, obviously. But I've heard about scholars in general. There's some who are so into academic scholarship that the idea of divine revelation, of inspiration, it's not there. That's just not considered academically respectable. It's just so gauche. And there's an old saying that says, if you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. When you spend so much time with the academic scholars of the liberal bent, the skeptical bent, and you want to be taken seriously by them, then yes, there are scholars who come out sounding very much like them. I'm not going to say anything about Evans himself. I'm just talking about what seems to be the case with certain scholars. So just this without any kind of compunction, just so casually dismiss what's in the Gospel according to John, and say, no, Jesus didn't really say that. That kind of seemed to me to be a gut punch. It almost seems like what he and Armin, this arch skeptic, are saying, they don't really sound all that different, do they?
No.
Let's continue in this discussion and see what else comes up.
I don't disagree with you too much on that point. I think John is studded with historical details.
Yeah.
Maybe you called them nuggets. That's not a bad way of describing John. Okay. But I think the synoptics are more than just some nuggets.
Okay, so let me just add to pursue it then. I mean, John, I think both of us are agreeing that John is not historically accurate. It's theologically been probably the most important of the Gospels, I would say, historically, and people relish the theological. But in terms of its historical accuracy, if you were there, you would not have heard Jesus say these things, probably. It's a later theological
No,
reflection.
not in so many words, not like that. No,
okay.
Not in so many words. So does that mean Dr. Evans thinks that Jesus did say those things, but just we don't have the exact direct quote?
No, I think he leans more to the idea that these were he said statements. At least that's what usually comes out of liberal scholarship, is that the so-called Johannine community, which were people who were taught by John, and then people who were taught by people who were taught by John, who were making up this kind of theology as they went along, and then retrodicting them back into Jesus. So once they decided that Jesus was the light of the world, they then put those words into Jesus' mouth and wrote it that way in the Gospel according to John, which was not written by John, but was a product of this so-called Johannine community.
But really, for a Christian, it's extremely inappropriate to put words into Jesus' mouth.
It is, and this is something else we could spend time on, maybe in a different program. But the idea that what people considered scripture, there was something called an inscriptional curse, and you find the church fathers talking about it and elsewhere, and you see it at least 3 or 4 times in the Bible itself, this idea that God will curse you if you change his words. You see that in Deuteronomy 4:2, you see it in Proverbs 30, you see it, of course, towards the end of Revelation, these warnings: do not add to his words, do not take away from his words. And we know from the writings of these early Christians that people were quite afraid to alter the words of the Lord. They believed Scripture was the Word of God. This idea that people would glibly take it upon themselves to put words into the mouth of Jesus as if he said them, this is completely a liberal construct. It has nothing to do with the actual books, with how they were written, with how they were received from the beginning, and with the kind of idea of the day that you do not change God's words. I'm very surprised to hear an evangelical scholar go along with this idea, and even right out saying, oh, we don't really disagree a lot on this, do we? Arch heretic Bart Ehrman.
Unfortunately, I'm surprised that you're still surprised. It seems like nothing's surprising anymore.
Yes, I can't criticize you for saying that, unfortunately. Then he talked about that there are historical details in John, but he called them, what did he call them?
Nuggets.
Nuggets. And you know what a nugget is? Like you're digging for gold and you go through this big ton of dirt and here and there you find a little piece of gold. So When you talk about historical nuggets in the gospel, and certainly when liberal scholars speak about...
That means most of it is not historical.
Exactly. Most of it is made up stuff, but here and there you might find a historical detail. And it's a way to... It's a neat get out of jail card free, because anytime you can find something demonstrating historicity, you can say, well, that's just a nugget. The rest is not historical. Well, where's your evidence for that? None. Trust me, I have a PhD. I'm a scholar. But here we have Dr. Armin, flat out saying, so you agree it's not historical, and Evan says, yep, I agree. He didn't say those things. Let's continue.
If you were there, you would not have heard Jesus say these things, probably. It's a later theological
No,
reflection.
Not in so many words, not like that. No,
okay.
I don't think so.
So if we toss John out, what
Well,
about...
we're not tossing John out, but... And by the way, Bart, I object to saying it's not historically accurate. Well, if something that isn't exactly historical, how is it not historically accurate? It'd be like saying, you mean the parable? The parable was a fiction that Jesus told? It's not an actual event? You mean it's not historically accurate?
Right. Well, we would have to argue what John was intending to produce, whether he was
That's exactly what the question
and
is.
we have no access to his intentions.
And that's and that's true for anything from antiquity, I suppose.
Okay,
but that's why we do exegesis.
All right, so if we agree that John is not historically accurate, which one of the Gospels is?
Yeah.
All right. No, you have said that Jesus didn't say, okay, you are not going to use John as a blueprint for writing the historical life of Jesus.
Wow. Any comments on that?
Okay, so it looks like Dr. Evans is trying to defend himself, but it sounds to me almost like saying John is like a historical fiction that got the details right, so in that way it's historically accurate, but it's still like a historical fiction book or a story that's set in that time period. You could get all the details right, but the story itself isn't true.
Yes, they could be seen that way. He likened it to a parable, as like a parable. What's scary here is he says, well, you can't say it's not historical if it wasn't meant to be historical, as it's a bogus charge on it. It is meant to be historical. To say that it's not historical is a huge problem. And then Armin is saying essentially, well, when it comes to historical Jesus, let's toss out the gospel according to John, which does sound very much like what Evans is saying. And then he says, no, we're not tossing it out. And people are laughing. I wonder where this discussion was held, because honestly, from the Christian point of view, this is not funny. This is not something that should be laughed at. And he says, we're not tossing out Jesus, but we're not tossing out the gospel according to John, but it's not historical.
Well, maybe he wants to keep it because of the nuggets.
It's like a parable, he said, though. He didn't say, well, he didn't even say there's history in it. He didn't even appeal the nuggets here. He said, well, I mean, you can't say it's historical, like a parable. If Jesus tells a parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and he's telling a story to teach a lesson, well, people don't think this actually happened. It's just a parable. Well,
yeah, but I guess now you have to ask, did Jesus really tell that parable?
Well, you would have to. But the thing here is, nobody would ask if those are historical because they're understood to be made-up stories meant to tell a lesson. So are we supposed to see the gospel according to John as that? A made-up story meant to teach lessons and nothing more. If not, then why is Evans calling this or comparing it to a parable? That makes no sense. Both of them made this mistake when they said that we have no access to John's intent. Well, we do exactly. He tells us flat out what his intention is. There in John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. Can you read that for us?
And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name.
But that seems to me a pretty clear statement of his intention in writing this.
Well, it does, but we know that with other important verses, liberals find ways to argue that, oh, those verses weren't really there? Or do they do that with these verses of intention in John? Does anyone say, oh, these aren't accurate, they weren't there?
Well, if they're saying that this wasn't even written by John, then they would say that, see, you can't use this to find John's intention, because this wasn't John writing it. This was some kind of Johannine community. And I can see liberal, skeptical scholars saying that. I don't know why an evangelical scholar would agree with that. And then perhaps what was actually interesting, you saw at the end of the clip, Dr. Arman said, so you don't consider John historically reliable, a basis for telling us a story about Jesus. Which gospel book do you consider historically reliable? What was Dr. Evans' answer?
I don't think, did he even give an answer?
There was silence. He not only did he not answer, but Dr. Arman was sitting there waiting for him to say something, and he didn't. There was no answer. And I'm sorry to say, but the kicker to all this is this little video clip posted on YouTube. It's titled, Craig Evans, Some Sayings in John Weren't Actually Said by Jesus. This was posted to YouTube by a Muslim apologist. Think about that.
That means it looks pretty bad for Christianity.
Muslims are using Dr. Evans to undermine the case for Christ.
Yeah, but isn't it that from your experience, the Muslim apologists tend to use scholars in place of evidence anyway? So then if you find a bad evangelical scholar, they will assume that constitutes evidence against Christianity.
Yes, we see that all the time. That's why in my opening statement in the debate with Dr. Shabir Ali, that's where I had to start, emphasize this fact that we need evidence. We can't just go by this scholar says this, that scholar says that. And we mentioned that before in this discussion, that you can't go that route. It becomes a huge problem when we just go by what is said by scholars. You can always find scholars to say the exact opposite of things. But here's what struck me at this point. I would very much, I would cringe if anything I taught about Jesus, about the Bible, about the one true God, if any of it was being posted by Muslims or any other non-Christian group to undermine Christianity. Okay? That is a serious, serious problem.
Do you know if Dr. Evans has posted any comments on the video explaining himself or what he really meant to say?
I'm not aware of any. We could look, but I have a feeling that what we saw is exactly what he holds to. And the reason I say that is because this is not rare among evangelical scholars now. They're very much the idea of divine inspiration, inerrancy. It's really gone. You will not find this in evangelical academia anywhere. They very much treat the Bible like it's treated by skeptics. You will often find the provisos say, well, I believe in inerrancy, but they make a hash of the meaning of the word because they find the Bible full of errors. So really, the problem here is I look at what Dr. Evans is saying and what Dr. Arman is saying, and to me it looks like they differ only in the degree of skepticism, not in the essence. Like with that approach, how do you even decide what's historical? If there are only nuggets in there, then how do you decide? John has a resurrection account. Is that historical?
Maybe they disagree on which parts are the nuggets.
They certainly do. But the question is, how do you decide then? What's your objective standard?
I guess there isn't one. Maybe if he actually did believe that other gospel books are historically accurate, I suppose he could cross-reference and whatever nugget is in another gospel book is historical.
You could. They try to have that as a criterion, the so-called multiply attestation. Although in this case, we have what Paul says is very clear. And if you have one good eyewitness, that should already be enough to determine the thing. But here's the problem, when it comes to, say, the resurrection even, and we've talked about some of this in other programs, and maybe we'll talk in more detail in other programs. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all have a resurrection. Paul talks about the resurrection. When two very corrupt ancient Greek manuscripts were discovered around the mid-19th century, and both of them were missing the last 12 verses of Mark, very questionably. One of them, called Codex Vaticanus, had this huge blank column left, as if the writer had left space to put in the last 12 verses. What he was copying from might have lost the end, and so he didn't have it, but he knew it belonged there. In the other one, the original pages with the end of Mark had been removed sometime later and replaced, and the end of Mark rewritten in a way that makes it look like could have had the original 12, but for some reason the scribe wanted to remove it. So, very suspicious. You have 1,600 or so manuscripts of Mark that have the end. The end is quoted by church fathers 150 years earlier than these two manuscripts. And yet, this was too good an opportunity to pass up. You had to insist these were the best manuscripts, the best text. And so Mark didn't actually have a resurrection. To sell that at first, it was, well, Mark probably did have one, but his original ending was lost, and this was made up to cover it. And it moved from that to saying, well, no, this is where he ended it. There was no resurrection. Along with that, all of the evidence that has Matthew being the first one written, that goes back to a great deal of testimony from the early church fathers who were in a position to know. The evidence was so strong that the most flaming liberal skeptical scholar didn't question it. That F.C. Bauer we talked about, he had Matthew first, to which he assigned a date of AD 130, and then Mark about 150. So that wasn't good enough. You then had to explain that Mark was actually first after all. Because then you could add in literary dependence, which we also talked about, where Matthew and Luke were copied from Mark. So Mark didn't have a resurrection. Matthew and Luke were copied from Mark, and what about the stuff they have that Mark doesn't? There must have been another document, they called that Q, and Q didn't have a resurrection. How do we know that? We don't. We don't have a Q. There never was a Q. But even if you assume there was a Q, we have no manuscript of Q. So we
couldn't know what it contained or didn't contain.
Exactly. There's no way to know that. However, scholars have proclaimed Q did not have they proclaimed Q existed, and they proclaimed Q did not have a resurrection. Trust us, we have PhDs. So now suddenly the two earliest sources about Jesus, Mark and Q, had no resurrection. You have to go to Matthew. But recently we've had evangelical scholars telling us that, that account in Matthew 27 about when Jesus died, how Old Testament saints came out of the tombs, wow, that was fictitious. You see, it was Greco-Roman bios and Jewish apocalyptic. When you see things like darkness and earthquakes and tombs opening and bodies rising, those weren't meant to be taken literally. They were just literary devices to show that a great person had died. And the problem with that is obvious. You see those exact same signs in the very next chapter where Jesus rises. So if these were not meant to be taken literally, Old Testament saints didn't really rise in Matthew 27, then surely by the same standards, you can't take literally the resurrection of Jesus in the very next chapter. So now, no resurrection in Q, in Mark, or in Matthew. You've got to go all the way to Luke. What's distinctive about Luke? What's different from Luke, between Luke and all the other New Testament writers?
Luke was a Gentile.
Luke was a Gentile, so he obviously didn't understand Jewish apocalyptic. He read those, and he thought it was meant to be literal, that Jesus actually rose. So Now all you're left with is John. Nothing in Q, nothing in Mark. No resurrection in Q, no resurrection in Mark, no resurrection in Matthew, no resurrection in Luke. You've got just John, but here we're just told this is a parable. This is wisdom literature. This you can't talk about its historicity since it wasn't meant to be historical. We don't know John's intention in writing it, but we know it wasn't meant to be seen as anything other than wisdom literature. Bing, bang, boom, the resurrection is gone. All left now is, well, Paul said so, and Paul was not an eyewitness. So this is the way liberal scholarship works, and I'm really not understanding why so many evangelicals buy into it. But here's what we're having. The historicity of John is incredibly important, and these challenges, the idea that John was legendary, not meant to be historical because it was written so late, is not true, as we've shown, and should not be accepted by any kind of evangelicals. The idea here, of course, depends on it being late, but as we've shown, it's not late enough. If it's first century, that's not late enough for this to be legendary. Being late is a necessary condition for legends, but it's not a sufficient condition. John's account of Jesus is not legendary. It's not wisdom literature. It's not a parable. It is a historical description of what happened, written by Jesus' closest earthly friend, who was carried along by the Holy Spirit, writing God-breathed scripture that we can fully trust.
Yeah, and with other gospel books, you mentioned that sometimes we can tell certain things by what the church fathers wrote. Did they have any comments on John?
Oh, they have many comments on John, but here's a terrific example of the chutzpah of liberal scholarship. Matthew was written first. We had that evidence from the church fathers, copious evidence about it. We have evidence about John, perhaps even more, because we have the testimony of people who were acquainted with the Apostle John himself, or who were taught by men who knew the Apostle John. We have Polycarp. Polycarp was a student of John. Irenaeus, who was a student of Polycarp, the student of John. We have people very close in a position to know, unlike liberal scholars from 20 centuries later. But here's what they did. When they had to go with Mark in priority, they needed Mark to be first so that they could undermine the resurrection. And the picture that I sketched out, you don't necessarily have liberal scholars coming right out and saying that yet. I think they're waiting to see how much damage evangelical scholars will do, but that is definitely what they're moving towards. When they decided you needed Mark to be first, and they thought, okay, Mark in priority, they got a 2 for here, 2 for 1, because once you say that Mark was written first, you could say, look at that. The early church fathers all got this wrong. They're not reliable. We don't have to pay attention to them. And we don't. Except, of course, we can find a comment here or there that supports whatever view you want to push. Then they're just so reliable. But everywhere else, no. You can't trust anything they have to say because, hey, they got the order of the gospel books wrong.
Okay, so you debunked the challenge about legends developing since there was no time for that to happen, but you said there were 3 reasons that the challenges to the gospel according to John are bogus. So the second one was about the date of the gospel according to John. What about that?
Yes, the date at which it was published. We've seen already that liberal skeptics, scholars try to push it off into the latter part of the 2nd century to allow for developments of legends. They were forced to go back on that because of manuscript evidence. They still want to keep it as late as possible. They push it into the 90s. That doesn't allow time for legends to develop, but they're trying at least to get out of eyewitness times, which even that, it really doesn't do. People can remember back that far. But the date of publication of the Gospel according to John, as we will see The evidence that we have on this, and it's pretty good evidence, points to a date of AD 64 or 65 for the publication of the Gospel according to John, which is kind of interesting that the date of publication of the last Gospel book published is earlier than the date liberal scholars assign to the first Gospel book published, which they say was Mark around AD 70. Now, with John being 64, 65, that is well within eyewitness times. We're talking now about 32 years after the events they describe, and people can remember important things much further back than that. So that puts it to about 32 years after. People can remember back that far for things that are important. And in fact, they can remember back much further. So even if John were in the 90s, it would not take it out of eyewitness times. But in point of fact, it was published 64 or 65. However, as we pointed out, and most probably because they're trying to get as late as possible, liberal scholars put it into the 90s. And shockingly, most, I would say almost all, evangelical scholars go along with that, or perhaps drag it back into the 80s or mid-80s to be daringly different, but still long after the actual date.
Okay, what would be the point of just putting it into the mid-80s? If there are actually evangelical scholars who want to be daringly different, why would they not go with 65 then?
Well, that's a good question, why they would do that. But first, let's look at the fact that they do that. John MacArthur, in his notes in his study Bible, says John wrote his gospel circa AD 80 to 90, about 50 years after he witnessed Jesus' earthly ministry. Josh McDowell, in his book Evidence for Christianity, Historical Evidences for the Christian Faith, shows a chart with the so-called conservative dating. And for John, he has AD 80 to 100. Carson, Moo, and Morris, in their textbook and introduction to the New Testament, the one we used in seminary, write this: if a date for the publication of the fourth gospel must be suggested, we may very tentatively advance AD 80 to 85. And then virtually every study Bible introduction, every Bible commentary, every Bible dictionary will give you this sort of date. And then that's what's taught in the seminaries, and then that's what goes down to the Christians, the lay Christians in the pews. If they use, for example, a study Bible, they will see a note like this for John. This is the one from the NKJV Study Bible, published by Thomas Nelson, the Signature Series. And for the date, they say, conservative scholars typically date the book between AD 85 and AD 95. The book makes no reference to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, implying that such a significant event must have occurred many years earlier. So that's what you're going to see. That's what the people reading their Bibles, their study Bibles and commentaries see. And that's what's accepted and hardly ever challenged.
So it couldn't be that maybe it hadn't happened yet. It had to be many years ago. Why do all the scholars agree on these dates?
Well, that's the question you asked before, and it's a good question. Why do all of these evangelical scholars agree on these dates? Somewhere between 80 and 100, 85, 90, 95. Is there reasonably strong evidence to support this date? Well, that would be one possibility. They could agree on these dates because there's strong evidence, or they could agree on these dates because all of them were told the same thing in seminary and accepted it uncritically. We've seen that kind of thing before. And here's another example, another reason to be wary of simply going with what scholars say rather than looking at the evidence. If you simply go by what scholars say, you'll say, yep, John is in the 80s or 90s, but that's not correct. when we just go with what the scholars say, we're making an assumption that the scholar who addresses the issue has studied it in depth. And that's a mistake. They really don't. In scholarship, you go in a seminary, you hear things that are told to you. What you're being told will depend very much on the tenor of the seminary. If you went to some place like Tübingen in the old days, you'd hear the flaming liberal stuff. It varies very much, but most students will go in there. They will hear what they're told, they will accept it, and they will not question it. They don't look at the evidence for this. We have one article on our website about the supposed problem. And I think it's Daniel Wallace who says this is the most intractable problem in reconciling the gospel accounts, that Matthew and Luke seem to disagree on when Jesus was born, because in Matthew's account, Herod the Great is still alive. And in Luke's account, the census was taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And they say that the dates of these people disagree dramatically. Herod died in 4 BC. Quirinius wasn't governor until AD 6. And you won't find a good explanation for this supposed contradiction. Now, in our article, we said, you know what, let's look back at the evidence. How do we know Herod died in 4 BC? How do we know Quirinius wasn't governor until AD 6? You start looking at the evidence, and you find that that's not the case at all. These dates are not based on evidence or on facts. When the evidence is taken into account, Herod died in late 2 or early 1 BC. Quirinius may well have been governor at that time. It comes down basically to a disagreement between Luke and Josephus, and that's what it comes down to. And Luke is the much superior historian who's writing much closer to the events and with access to eyewitnesses than Josephus. That's what you find out if you look at the evidence, but if you don't, then this becomes such an intractable problem. And in most cases, when a scholar addresses something, if it's not in his particular area of expertise, he doesn't really know it that well. He's just heard it from other people. J.R.R. Tolkien once said, "A wise man speaks only of what he knows." And it really isn't enough to sit in a class, hear a professor say something. You have to ask for the evidence for that, and then you have to assess it. And most people don't. As the historian M.J. Harper says in his book, The History of Britain Revealed, quote, "If that version is taught formally to you at school by authority figures, then repeat it to you as an undergraduate by even more highly regarded authority figures, and all your colleagues agree that it's more or less self-evidently true, you tend pretty much to go along with things." And we just can't do that. So those are the two possibilities. One, they're either following strong evidence on this, or it is just one of those ideas that everyone knows is true and they repeat it, but it really isn't.
So which one is it then?
Well, let's look at the evidence they offer for these late dates, and then we can try to figure out if that evidence is good or not. Now, here we have the Holman Apologetics Commentary on the Bible, the volume on the Gospels and Acts. The chapter on John is written by Andreas Köstenberger, and he gives 7 reasons for dating John into the 90s, maybe 80s or 90s. So let's look at the reasons and then assess them, think about them. He writes, "The earliest date of writing would seem to be after AD 70 in light of John's reference to Peter's martyrdom, circa AD 65 to 66, in his Gospel, chapter 21, verse 19. Now, I've seen others saying that. One functionary with Creation Ministries International writes this: "Probably the inference to be drawn from John 21:19 is that Peter had by his death glorified God when chapter 21 was composed. Peter died in AD 64 or 65 Dates earlier than that for the composition of the fourth gospel seem unlikely. And this was in an article called The Resurrection in Genesis, posted on the Creation Ministries International website. So that's the argument. Now, let's look at that passage. John 21:18-19 reads this. Most assuredly, this is Jesus speaking, and he's speaking to Peter here. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. So this is a predictive prophecy by Jesus about the death of Peter. Now, when was Jesus speaking?
Like AD 33.
Yeah, 33. This is in the 40 days between his resurrection and his ascension, the 40 days he spent with his apostles. So the year AD 33. That's when it was said, that's when the prophecy was made. Now, if Jesus could actually foretell the future, so that a prophecy he made can be recorded in a gospel book, does it need to have been fulfilled prior to the writing of the book?
No.
Of course not. Of course not. Interestingly, this same CMI functionary, talking about the dates of the Synoptic Gospel books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, points out that Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple in these books. Matthew 24, 1-2, Mark 13, 1-2, and it's in Luke 19 as well, 43-44. And she points out that this prophecy is in the books, but there's no mention that they were fulfilled. And if the prophecies had been fulfilled, by this time, certainly they should have been mentioned. So she's not just accepting that a prophecy could be made by Jesus, a genuine predictive prophecy, but that it could be recorded in the book without its fulfillment recorded if the fulfillment had not happened yet. So why is it different here in John 21? When Jesus makes a prophecy about the death of Peter, why should we think that it must have been fulfilled before the book was written?
No reason, but even, aren't they saying he died in 64 or 65? If that's the case, and they think it has to be written after, why does that mean putting John into the 90? That's way after.
That's an obvious point, and I'm glad you pointed that out. I'm not sure why others miss it. If this had to have been written after Peter's martyrdom, then that puts any date after Peter's martyrdom. If Peter died in 64, this book could have been written in anywhere from 64 onwards. There's no reason to push it late into the 90s. So all that would mean is that the earliest possible date would be AD 64. So do you consider this first argument to carry any merit at all?
No.
No.
What else do they have?
Well, let's look at the second reason given to us by Kostenberger. He says this. He points to the implicit indication that at the time of writing the temple had already been destroyed, which happened in AD 70. We may infer the latter point by John's presentation of Jesus as the new temple. What do you think? Does that impress you?
No. Does a physical building have to have been destroyed in order for Jesus to be presented as the new temple?
I wouldn't think so. And once again, when was Jesus' ministry? Between about AD 30 to 33, which means he said this before. He said it while the temple was still standing. So why would it have to have been, why would the temple already have to be destroyed to record this? Unless we're hinting that Jesus didn't really say this. And it was made up after the fact by his followers, retrodicted in his word. That's the way liberal scholarship operates. There's no implicit indication that the temple was destroyed.
Yeah, I know that the issue of the destruction of the temple is important in the dating of the Synoptic Gospels.
Yes, as we pointed out, Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple in some detail, to the point where not one stone will be left upon another. And although that prophecy is recorded, its fulfillment isn't. And we would expect that the fulfillment would have been recorded if it had happened by that time. Because elsewhere, prophecies are made and their fulfillment is recorded, even if it's not a particularly major one. If you look at Acts chapter 11, verses 27 to 28, we see this. Could you read that out for us?
And in these days prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world, which also happened in the days of Claudius Caesar.
So there's Agabus, shows up a couple of times in the book of Acts, but not a major character, making a prophecy about something that's not a major world-shaking event.
Well, how is a great famine throughout the whole world not a world-shaking event?
Technically, it's the Roman world. Well, famines weren't exactly unknown in the ancient world. But in this case, it became the impetus for the Gentile churches to collect donations to help out the church in Jerusalem, and you see that mentioned a number of times in Paul's letters. But that's as far as salvation history, as far as the New Testament accounts go, that's its only significance. And after this passage, we're told about how the church decided to take up this donation to the Jerusalem church. So that's its only significance in terms of the account. So it's not a major thing. It's not like the resurrection of Jesus or the crucifixion of Jesus. But the fulfillment is still recorded. Fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies are recorded copiously. And interestingly, in the Gospel according to John, the one that's under dispute here, there's a couple of Jesus' own prophecies, the fulfillment of which is recorded for us. If you look at John chapter 18, for example, and then verse 9. Can you read that out for us? This is during the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Oh, verse 5?
Verse 9.
That the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me I have lost none.
Yes, see? Verse 8, Jesus answered, when they've come out, the mob has come out to arrest him. He says, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled, which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. So there's that prophecy from Jesus was made earlier in the book, and here it's being fulfilled, and that's recorded. We see something like that in verse 32 as well, in the same chapter. Starting in verse 31, then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your own law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. They would be crucified. So you expect, particularly in John, if certain prophecies or indications are fulfilled, it should be mentioned.
Okay, that's so for the Synoptic Gospels, as in them Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple isn't included. So how does that affect the dating of the Gospel according to John?
True. The Synoptic Gospels have that specific prophecy about the destruction of the temple, and so we could say the fulfillment should be recorded there. But in the Gospel according to John, there's not this specific reference. That prophecy of Jesus about the destruction of the temple is not recorded in the Gospel according to John. But there are a couple of passages in the Gospel according to John where it would seem that the destruction of the temple should be mentioned if it had happened by then. For example, John 4:19 to 21, and that's during the conversation that takes place where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in Sychar. Can you read that verse for us, 19 to 21?
The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where one ought to worship. Jesus said to her, Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father.
Now, that's an interesting comment. Because Jerusalem, you recall, was selected by God himself as the place of worship, the place for his temple, the epicenter of Jewish worship. You see that in Deuteronomy 12:5, 1 Kings 11:36. This was the place where they would come to do the sacrifices. Once the temple was built, they could not do sacrifices elsewhere. So it really was crucial to worship in Jerusalem. And the idea that Jerusalem would one day no longer be that epicenter of worship was a non-starter to Jews. Why would we do it anywhere else? That's where the temple is. So certainly here we would think that John would have mentioned the destruction of the temple and the devastation of the Jews by the Romans, which went a very long way towards ending worship in Jerusalem. At a minimum, it showed that such a thing was indeed a viable possibility. So you would think that where he says, the hour is coming where you will neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem worship the Father, that there would be mentioned that the temple was destroyed. So yeah, worship ended there.
So that's why instead of saying that John must have been before AD 70, they say that it must have been far after, so that people forgot about that major event. They would have forgotten 20 years later.
I don't think they would have forgotten, but the point still is, in the context of that discussion, you would expect it to be mentioned. And it's not the only place where, in John, where you would expect a mention of the destruction of the temple if it had happened.
So where's the other place then?
The other place in the Gospel according to John where you would really expect that there would be a mention of the destruction of the temple, if it had already happened by this time, is John 11:47-52. Could you read that out for us, please?
Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, "What shall we do? For this man works many signs. If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation." And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish." Now he did not say this on his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who are scattered abroad.
Yes, so you see what's happening here. Here's where Caiaphas is suggesting that they should have Jesus put to death in order to spare Jerusalem and the Jewish nation. That's basically saying, look, let's turn over it to keep our city from being destroyed. So it seems to me that this passage calls out for mention of the destruction not only of the temple, but of the Jewish place and nation, which took place in the year AD 70. Because the high priest here seems to be prophesying that Jesus would die instead of the Jewish nation. That is, that the Romans would not destroy them if Jesus died for them. Jesus did die, and yet the Romans did destroy the place and nation. This seeming contradiction virtually demands an explanatory note, and we can fully expect that John would have provided one had that destruction already come to pass. The absence of such a comment indicates that this gospel book was written prior to AD 70, the time of that destruction.
Well, yes, but now have you just said that there's a contradiction?
I haven't said there's a contradiction, not in the text of the Bible. What we see is Caiaphas saying, okay, there's a record that Caiaphas said that if we put Jesus to death, we should do that, we should put him to death, because if we don't, the Romans will destroy this place and nation. Now we know that that's not the case. The death of Jesus was as the sacrifice for our sins to save the world. It had nothing to do with keeping the Jewish nation and the Jewish place intact. So Caiaphas was mistaken there. He was correct only about the fact that Jesus would die for the nation, which he did. He died for all people. As we read in John, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for that nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So that is accurate prophecy. The opinion that by killing Jesus, the nation would be spared by the Romans, the place would not be destroyed by the Romans, that was Caiaphas' own idea.
Oh, that's why in the passage for that first part it uses the word said, but in the part that actually is true, it uses the word prophesied.
Yes, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. That's the only part of what Caiaphas said that counts as prophecy. So there's no contradiction in what he said, but once the place and the nation were destroyed, people then might read this and say, wait a minute. I thought that Jesus being put to death would prevent the Romans from destroying the place and nation. Now, that would be a wrong conclusion, but it's one that people could reach, and this is why I would think that if the temple and the city had already been destroyed at the time of this writing, John certainly would have mentioned and pointed out that this was Caiaphas' opinion. He was wrong about that. So these are two good arguments for saying that John was published before AD 70. Published, by the way, means released for public use. Before AD 70, there are some arguments that are not so good. There is one argument here sometimes where John refers to features of Jerusalem that existed before the destruction of the city. That's the way it was before the destruction, but was no longer there after the destruction. And some people would say, well, look, John speaks about this in the present tense. For example, in John chapter 5, verse 2, we read, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches." And they say, look, after the destruction of the city, there was no pool of Bethesda anymore. So John is writing as if Jerusalem is still standing. The problem with that argument has been pointed out by some scholars is that there is in Greek something called the historic present, where you use the present tense even to describe events in the past, and John does use that. So do all the gospel writers, and so do we in English sometimes. We might talk about, well, yesterday I went to the store, and I'm walking down the aisles when this guy comes up to me and says, so-and-so. We're using the present tense there, even though we're describing something in the past.
Will it be a single use of the present tense and the rest of the passage switches back to a past tense, or would you expect to see a series of present tense verbs?
You might, if there are entire pericopes, so like little accounts where it's all written in present, even though it happened in the past. But yes, often you will get out of the present and move back into the past. It's a stylistic choice of the writer. So that is not something that I would use as an argument for dating John earlier than 70, but the lack of mention of the destruction of the temple is a good argument. And then there are others which we will get to, but first let's look at these arguments for putting it late. The next argument we saw from Kirsten Berger is, well, he says that because of, and we've talked about this before, the discovery of that papyrus P52 makes a terminus ante quem, a date before which, like the latest possible date, which he will put as AD 135, the date of the papyrus. As I've pointed out, that papyrus could be just as easily dated to the year 100. Really shouldn't go to 135, but that's where he has it. And he says you kind of have to allow it a certain period of time for the gospel according to John to be copied and to reach Egypt, where this manuscript was found. So he says on the back end, sometime should be allowed for the manuscript to be written and copied and make its way to Egypt, so that the date of writing in the 80s or early 90s seems most likely. Do you see a problem with that?
I'm not sure.
Well, if we take 135 as the terminus ante quem, and we allow some time for it to move to Egypt, say 20 years, and we're down to 115, 30 years, we're down to 105. that just gives you the latest possible date. It means it could be anywhere from 105 backwards to the time of the events. Now, we know that from the church writings that John was the last gospel written. Luke was published in the year 48 or 49, which means John could have been anywhere from 50 to 105. Anywhere in there. So why is 80 or 90s most likely? Why is that more likely than the 70s or the 60s?
Maybe they're just trying to pick a number in between.
Yes, well, they are picking a number, and they're saying it's most likely, but likely means that the probability is greater than other choices. Okay? It's actually a mathematical concept. You can't just say likely, but you see this very often in biblical scholarship. You take an idea, you like the idea, you slap the word likely on it.
Because you like the idea.
Yes, to make it sound more authoritative somehow. But if you're going to say it's likely, you have to give some reasons why 80s or early 90s is more likely than the 70s or the 60s. They don't do that. They simply assert it. And as I said, because of the lack of mention of the destruction of the temple, 80s and early 90s is most certainly not the most likely. And then their next argument, they say, first, while the Synoptics and Paul refer to Jesus' divinity, John is even more overt in lodging such claims, which makes it likely that a certain amount of additional time elapsed between the writing of the Synoptics and Paul's letters and the composition of John's gospel.
Sounds like guesswork. Could be that. Didn't John tell us, as you mentioned, didn't John tell us the purpose for which he's writing?
That seems to me to be more than just a guesswork. This seems kind of sinister. Because what this is saying is John has a higher Christology, a higher picture of Jesus, clear designations of his deity. Okay, well, was Jesus deity?
Yes.
Then it could have been anywhere in the writings. We've pointed out already that it's clearly there in Paul's letters, which these scholars will tell you predate any of the gospel books. But the idea that somehow enough time has to pass between the synoptics and John for John to have this kind of picture suggesting that this is not an authentic picture of Jesus, that it took the church decades before they figured out or came to the idea that Jesus is deity, which would suggest then that, yes, this is a legendary theological development of the church rather than an accurate historical picture.
Well, of course, that's what the skeptics want to present.
Well, that is exactly what they present. That's what the skeptics present, the liberal scholars, the Muslim apologists like Shabir Ali. Why would you find this in an evangelical commentary, though? Why would you find this in an apologetics commentary?
Wait, you mean all this time you've been reading from an evangelical apologetics book?
I told you, this is the Holman Apologetics Commentary on the Bible.
Oh, all this time I thought you were reading a book by some skeptic.
Yeah, and this is the problem. As I mentioned before, evangelical scholars tend to just pick up what they hear and they don't assess it. I wonder what would happen if you said, look, what you're saying basically is that this picture, the deity of Jesus, is a theological, legendary development, something the church cooked up in the decades after Jesus, thinking about it 60 years later, they thought, oh, maybe he's deity. Like, how is that acceptable? If Jesus was deity, then that's what he was from the start. And that's the picture we have here in the Gospel according to John, written by an eyewitness, by the man who was the closest personal friend of Jesus during Jesus' time on earth, and teachings that are exactly the same as you find in Paul's letters. So how could this possibly be an argument, an acceptable argument for the late dating of the Gospel according to John? It absolutely cannot be. Next then, he Relying on D.A. Carson here, he says that if John's Gospel was written after the destruction of the temple, it is likely that a certain amount of time had to pass between this momentous event and the writing of John's Gospel. Carson makes this point while, quote, "It is hard to believe that the date was immediately after AD 70, the destruction of the temple. The reverberations around the empire for both Jews and Christians were doubtless still too powerful. A little time needed to elapse before a document like the fourth gospel could be free not to make an explicit allusion to the destruction of the temple." You see a problem there?
Well, so people never write about traumatic events until time elapses, or what?
Well, yes, that's pretty interesting, that the idea that they couldn't write about it after the destruction of the temple, right away after, because it's too powerful and it's reverberating, so you have to have a big period of time passing between the destruction of the temple and John writing this and not mentioning the destruction of the temple. Well, the obvious problem with that is what you've pointed out before. This could mean that it was written before the destruction of the temple. That's the obvious conclusion, not that it was written far after. Seriously, if the destruction of the temple happened in the year 70 and John wrote it in 85, that's 15 years later. We're now 21 years removed from 9/11. Does that mean people don't mention that anymore and they talk about New York City, or you can write about the history of New York and not mention that? I don't think so. It just makes absolutely no sense at all. And in fact, the fact that John doesn't mention it, even though there are places where he should mention it, doesn't suggest that was written long after the fact. It suggests strongly that was written before the fact.
And besides, for John, being a Christian following the new covenant, would the destruction of the temple, which is part of the old covenant, have been so reverberating that he wouldn't write about it, really?
I think he would write about it in the context of those two passages where we mentioned it, where it seems reasonable at that point that he would mention if it had already happened. We would expect Matthew, Mark, and Luke to mention it since they recorded Jesus' prophecy about it. It's not so much about how much it reverberates as the fact that the context of what they're writing kind of calls for it. And the next reason that we're given by Kustenberger is this. John does not refer to the Sadducees, a sect active in Jesus' day but rendered inactive subsequent to the temple's destruction. John's lack of reference to the Sadducees, likewise, makes perfect sense if John writes a decade or so after AD 70. What do you think of that argument?
Okay, well, in the other case, there were passages where the context was such that one would specifically expect him to mention the destruction of the temple if it had happened already. Is there anything in John where we would expect that he would need to mention the Sadducees?
That's a very good point. John is writing about Jesus and what he did and what he claimed, and especially about his death and resurrection on the cross. He's not giving a travelogue for ancient Israel. He's not giving a political rundown of what's going on there. He's only mentioning things that are relevant to the picture of Jesus that he is presenting to us. Now, mention of the Sadducees, this is interesting because Matthew mentions the Pharisees 29 times, and he mentions the Sadducees 7 times. Mark, on the other hand, whom the skeptics say is the first gospel book written, he mentions the Pharisees 12 times. He mentions the Sadducees only once. Only once. Luke mentions the Pharisees 21 times and the Sadducees only once. John mentions the Pharisees 20 times. He doesn't mention the Sadducees. So there's one fewer mentions than Mark and Luke. So none of the gospel writers really had this big emphasis on the Sadducees. Matthew mentions them less than a quarter of the number of times he mentions the Pharisees. And again, Matthew is written to a specifically Jewish audience, so maybe that's why that's significant to them. Now, another problem with this argument is, what about the scribes? The scribes, also after the destruction of the temple, they became far more influential. Sadducees may have disappeared, not the scribes. So by this kind of reasoning, if John was written after AD 70, he's not going to talk about the Sadducees, but he should talk about the scribes, shouldn't he?
I guess if context calls for it.
Yeah, if that reasoning is proper, Kostenberger is saying nothing about context. He's simply saying that because the Sadducees were no longer influential, they should not be mentioned. The Pharisees are mentioned because they are still influential. But in that case, the scribes should also be mentioned. They're still influential. And if we look at Matthew, who mentions the Pharisees 29 times and the Sadducees 7 times, he mentions the scribes 22 times as a group. Mark mentions the Pharisees 12 times, the Sadducees only once, but the scribes 21 times. Luke mentions the Pharisees 21 times, the Sadducees once, and the scribes 15 times. Now, about Kostenberger's arguments, John shouldn't mention the Sadducees much. He mentions it only one fewer time than Mark and Luke. But he should be mentioning the scribes, because they're influential after AD 70. And yet, he mentions the scribes only once in his entire book. So trying to use the number of times he mentions different groups simply does not work. It's a non-starter when it comes to assigning a date to the gospel according to John. And then the next argument from Kostenberger is this: the alert reader notes John's dual reference to the Sea of Galilee as the Sea of Tiberias in 6:1 and 21:1. Historically, Herod Antipas, one of Herod the Great's sons, established the city of Tiberias, named after the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled AD 14 to 37, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee around AD 17 to 18, according to Josephus in Antiquities. Gradually then, people came to refer to the Sea of Galilee by the name of the Sea of Tiberias, because Tiberias was the most prominent city located by it. Evidence suggests that this shift probably took place in the 80s or 90s.
What evidence?
Well, that's a very good question. What evidence? Ms. Kostenberger doesn't give us any evidence to support this claim.
There's no footnotes or anything?
No footnotes, nothing. And it's what he says is absolutely not valid. Okay? Yes, the city of Tiberias was founded on the shore of this sea in the year AD 18 and eventually gave its name to the sea as well. And some scholars will say that the name change did not occur until later in the century. However, it is impossible to make such a conclusion. The year 18 gives us the earliest possible date for the name of the Sea of Tiberias, while references by early writers such as Pausanias, the Sibylline Oracles, Josephus, and Strabo can only give us a terminus ante quem. In other words, when these people call it the Sea of Tiberias, we know that by that time, at least some people were calling it that. But that doesn't tell us when the name change happened. It happened sometime between these endpoints, but it's impossible to be more specific. If anything, the fact that John 6:1 reads, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee," which is the Sea of Tiberias, indicates that the name change was not yet complete. Some people were still referring to it as the Sea of Galilee, others as the Sea of Tiberias. The Jewish people, they clung to that name Sea of Galilee. They didn't want to call it after the Roman emperor, the pagan Roman emperor and their oppressor. But the Gentiles went over to calling it the Sea of Tiberias. So John mentioning both suggests he has a mixed audience. Some would know it this way, some would know it that way. But to argue that because he calls it that puts it into the 80s or 90s is absolutely baseless. It's no argument at all for a post-AD 70 date.
At best, is extremely weak.
It would be extremely weak if you could even find the time point, the specific point in time, if there even was one, at which it switched over to the title Sea of Tiberias officially, which it never did as far as we know. This is why John, as I pointed out, mentions both titles. So I would say that it's a non-argument. I wouldn't call it a weak argument. I would say it's a non-argument. The fifth and final point that we see in Kostenberger here is, again, a very troubling one to me. He writes, Thomas's confession of Jesus as, quote, my Lord and my God, unquote, in 2028 is most readily understood against the backdrop of the Roman Emperor Domitian's insistence that he be called Dominus et Deus, Latin for Lord and God. Since Domitian ruled from AD 81 to 96, this too suggests the likelihood that John's Gospel was written sometime in the mid-80s or early 90s.
And why should we assume that Thomas stole the idea from Domitian? It's not like it's so distinctive, is it? If someone actually is your Lord and your God, which Jesus was.
Well, if others could use that title, then yes, this argument would become quite moot. But I see it as problematic in the attitude behind it. Because the question is, when did Thomas actually say this? When did Thomas say to Jesus, my Lord and my God? It was when the risen Jesus appeared to him 8 days after he appeared to the other disciples. That's when it happened. So the year 33, AD 33. And that was long before Domitian, so he couldn't have been imitating this call that Domitian put out for himself, unless the gospel writer retrodicted these words into Thomas's mouth. In other words, Thomas didn't really say this, but the gospel writer writing this up during the time of Domitian, who wants to call himself Lord and God, puts these words into Thomas's mouth in order to point out that it's Jesus who's Lord and God, not Domitian. That is a big, big problem. It would mean that what's in the gospel book isn't historically true here. It's made up, and the gospel writers felt free to make up stuff to advance their agenda. Stuff that wasn't even true. And then you'd have to ask, okay, what else did they make up that's not true? You see why so much of evangelical scholarship is knowledge falsely so called, as we see in 1 Timothy 6:20, and why it's so counterproductive and unacceptable. As the old saying goes, with friends like these, who needs enemies?
Yeah, and also, before just saying it's retrodicted, I'd expect some proof. It seems to me like you have to ask, why does the Roman emperor think of this particular title, my Lord and my God? Maybe that's what people were already using at the time to describe their supreme ruler, and then because that's already around, that's why he wants the title for himself.
That's very possible. Maybe it's the other way around. It's not Jesus, gospel writer John here, imitating Domitian. Maybe it's the other way around. Domitian taking the title for himself. There would be no way to know, actually, so it's not much of an argument. The only way you could get around it and say that, well, you're not retrodicting it. It's as if, yes, Thomas really said it, but Matthew, Mark, Luke didn't bother to include that. Only John included it because Domitian is saying these things. If you do it that way, it's not a retrodiction, but would raise the issue of why did he decide to put it in and the others didn't.
Please note that this is a multi-part series. If you have missed any episodes and would like to listen to them, they will all be available on our YouTube channel and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. You can find the links to these on our website, truthinmydays.com, or you can look for Truth in My Days on YouTube as one word.
But either way, the point is, even if Thomas' confession were meant to be a polemic response to human rulers usurping the title of Lord and God, Domitian was, in fact, by no means the first to use this title. The Emperor Augustus is called tu Theu kai Curio, the God and Lord, in the Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 1143 from around AD 1, so when Jesus was a little baby. Some Hellenist Ptolemaic rulers also took that title for themselves. And all of these predate the career of Jesus, and therefore predate the earliest possible date of the Gospel according to John. So that title was used long before the Gospel according to John was written. Second, it seems clear that Thomas' confession really was not based on an imperial formula, but based more on Old Testament titles that are given to God himself. So they point, in fact, at Jesus' deity. Critics will argue, well, these Old Testament titles given to God were not exact parallels to Domitian's title. But Thomas' statement isn't an exact parallel either. So this argument seems to me to go nowhere.
So whether the title came from Domitian or Augustus, and whether it's early or not, it would still be a problem if someone were able to convincingly argue that Thomas's statement was retrodicted to elevate the picture of Jesus.
Yes, it would be. But here's the thing, you can't do that. The only argument they had was, well, that's the title Domitian used. But since it was used even before Jesus' time himself, you have no basis to argue that. It would just be pure fantasy. And then we'd have to ask, should we believe John, who was the closest personal friend of Jesus, eyewitness to the events, writing what he saw, or some liberal skeptic scholar from 20 centuries later who was born almost 2,000 years too late for his opinion to be of the slightest importance on this? Now, more to the point, more important than the fact that others use it, as we've said, Thomas' statement was made in the year 33, long before Domitian's time. So it wasn't meant to be a riposte to the emperor. Thomas called Jesus my Lord and my God because that is who Jesus is and who he's being presented as being throughout the gospel according to John. Going all the way back to the very first verse. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In John 8:58, where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. So Thomas' statement actually sums up the claims of Jesus as presented in this book, which is no doubt why it was included. Jesus is repeatedly identified in the New Testament as Lord. John 6:68, for example, John 9:38, also in Acts 2:36, Romans 7:25, and so many other places. He's identified as God in Acts 2:28, in Romans 9:5, in Titus 2:13, 2 Peter 1:1, Hebrews 1:8. In fact, he is explicitly called God and Lord in 2 Thessalonians 1:12, which by all accounts greatly predates the time of Domitian. So Thomas' confession is not a response to Domitian worship. If anything, as you suggested, Domitian, a persecutor of Christians, may have tried to usurp for himself the title that Christians had already long been using for Jesus. The imperial cult argument, then, for late dating the gospel according to John is utterly vacuous.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.